cara. Bom dia, meus queridos. Today I want to talk about the giant wave of democratizations that so fundamentally transformed the political and economic landscape of Latin America in the 1980s and the 1990s. But first, let's hear a word from our sponsors.
Estão têm que procurar Jesus, para Jesus curar vocês, porque ele está matando por causa que vocês estão arrumando outro Deus, Aparecida, a Nossa Senhora e outros que não existem.
Valeu, muito obrigado.
Now, ironically enough, the so-called third wave of democratization, that which took down nearly every authoritarian regime in Latin America in the course of little more than a decade, did not truly get started in Latin America, but instead in those countries that in centuries past had dominated that region as a colonial holding. In Portugal in 1974, the so-called Carnation Revolution swept away a military regime that had ruled the country since 1933. Just a year later in Spain, the notorious old dictator Francisco Franco died of a heart attack. His regime, then, which took power way back in 1936 in a civil war, then quickly fell to the forces of democracy. Now, at the time, much of Latin America was really still in the thick of recently imposed dictatorships, and some countries, like Argentina, hadn't even gotten started yet. But nowhere did this news from the Iberian Peninsula go unnoticed. And the grand message was this, and it was unequivocal. Those seemingly all-powerful dictatorships could in fact be overthrown. Maybe not by the power of arms per se, but by the power of protest. People power, as it were. Now, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, the biggest single baseball bat blow to these authoritarian regimes had little to do with any great moral commitment to human freedom. In fact, as Bill Clinton might have said at the time, it's the economy, stupid. Indeed, the oil crisis of 1973, which simultaneously increased production cost and the accessibility of international loans for Latin American countries, and which eventually led to the massive debt crisis of 1982, were probably the most important factors undermining authoritarian regime across the region. As we saw with the Brazilian economic miracle and also with Pinochet's Chile in the late 1970s, many Latin Americans could actually be convinced that dictatorship was really okay so long as jobs, money, and cheap colored TVs were still abundant. But if those material delights were to somehow go away suddenly, now that's another question altogether. Still, as things turned out, there was no lack of interest in freedom, as it were, and the flower revolutions of Spain and Portugal helped reawaken a popular desire for democracy all across the region. Moreover, even though the Cold War was still in vigor, by the 1980s, the communist bloc had become much less married to this old mission of exporting revolution worldwide, and instead focused on the containment of capitalism, so to speak. Consequently, Latin America's most authoritarian opposition to communism, all those military generals in tight-fitting parade suits and goofy hats, had become somewhat passé. It seems that people all over the world were now rejecting that stiff and rigid purism of both the Marxist revolutionaries on one hand, and on the other hand, the right-wing military reactionaries. What people now wanted was leaders in civilian clothes. Leaders who represented civility, compromise, and Coca-Cola. Perhaps everyone didn't know it yet, but the times, they were changing. Important to these changes in political culture was a change in the focus of international institutions like the United Nations, which focused from classic balance of power politics to issues of quality of life, particularly with respect to freedom and democracy. International non-governmental organizations also proliferated during this time. Groups like Amnesty International and other such human rights organizations. They did much to create links between the concerned middle classes of the global north and those people resisting authoritarianism in the global south. My own sister, when she was in high school, for example, wrote a scathing letter to Augusto Pinochet in Chile, imploring him, for the love of God, to stop torturing your people, man. Of equal importance were the forces of market globalization. For a time, dictators like Pinochet could keep his people quiet and contented by getting them access to cheap colored TVs. But before long, those same TVs would start giving people a glimpse of how people lived elsewhere in the world, in places like Hollywood, America, where a society could clearly be both rich and free at the same time. Lastly, and to the delight of all those who love life, most Latin America's authoritarian regimes by the 1980s no longer had the stomach to do what they had done on so many previous occasions throughout the course of the 20th century. That is, when confronted with mass protest, they were no longer going to mow down their citizens with machine gun fire in public plazas, or fill up secret detention centers with political opponents, only to torture them and make their bodies disappear from the face of the earth. As I mentioned before, by the 1980s, things were changing. Now the world was watching, and they were watching on colored TVs. And this softness, of course, of those military regimes and dictatorships ended up emboldening people to speak their minds. In Argentina, support for the junta collapsed before a tide of popular rage in 1982, ushering in democratic elections by the end of that year. In Brazil, millions of people took to the streets in 1984 demanding direct elections for president, compelling the military regime to fold. In El Salvador, even in the midst of a civil war, a military junta gave way to some semblance of democracy in 1982, and in no small part due to pressure from the United States at the time. And in Chile, as you have read, in 1988, the notorious General Pinochet was voted out of office in a referendum that he himself had ordered. In all of these cases, massive mobilizations of people from all or most economic sectors and social groups came together for one common purpose, which was to overthrow the anti-democratic status quo and usher in a new era. And it worked. The age of dictatorship in Latin America came down crashing to an end. But what did the new era of democracy bring? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but first, a word from our sponsors.
Opa, muito obrigado. Tem alguma mensagem para os americanos? Não?
So what did democracy bring to Latin America? Recall from our previous video about TINA that, at least initially, it brought neoliberalism. That is, the opening of national economies to global competition, free trade as it were, plus the privatization of state-owned enterprises, the liberalization of capital flows, and the retreat of the state from the realm of social welfare. And as we have discussed, this in most cases, while effectively taming the wild horse of hyperinflation, also served to dramatically increase inequality and deepen poverty for millions of people. But democracy brought other important changes too, not the least of which was a massive growth in what we call civil society, and this being seen in the proliferation of political parties, non-governmental organizations, and protest movements, all of which would take advantage of recently opened democratic channels to influence government policy with regard to so many issues that I really can only mention a fraction of them here. Just in Brazil, for example, an environmental movement emerged to protect the Amazon rainforest, a landless peasant movement helped force agrarian reform, and numerous culture groups like Quilombolas, we'll talk about them next week, whose members trace their ancestry to slave revolts hundreds of years ago, won guarantees of state protection for their lands. In the Andean region, meanwhile, a transnational indigenous movement emerged, and it transformed the region's politics, culminating in the unthinkable, the election in 2006 of an indigenous man named Evo Morales to the Bolivian presidency. And then in the late 1990s and early 2000s, another monumental change occurred, ushered in by the 1998 election of the self-declared socialist Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. The so-called Pink Tide soon swept across much of Latin America. Within the span of a few years, leftists came to power in Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador, El Salvador, and almost even in Mexico. We'll talk about that at another time. All of them were challenging to some degree or another the neoliberal model that had been so deeply embraced as the only way forward just a decade before. In many of these countries, including Brazil, Ecuador, Venezuela, the first decade of the millennium saw dramatic improvements in the wealth and living standards of their populations overall, while aggressive anti-poverty programs significantly reduced inequality and poverty for the first time in modern history. This helps to explain why, during my first stay in Brazil back in 2008, everyone I met seemed to be so damn optimistic about the future. Of course, as my mother always told me, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. And so it was. That in that same year of 2008, the American housing crisis provoked a worldwide recession that illuminated the first real fissures in Latin America's pink tide. Then, a few years later, a much bigger bomb went off, one that no one seemed to even know was there. As it turned out, since the early 2000s, a significant part of Latin America's rapidly growing wealth came from one source alone: the strategic raw material exports to China. When China finally put the brakes on its importation program around 2010, many of Latin America's national economies hit a rock wall. Naturally, at this point of incipient economic crisis provoked by the Chinese lack of importations, Latin America's publics began to scrutinize their governments again, just as they had done back in 1982 when it was the military regimes that ruled. Now the problem wasn't torture and disappearances, but largesse and corruption. This too was enough to bring millions of people out into the streets all across Latin America. Often such protests were sparked by small things like a 10-cent increase in bus fare or an equivalent increase in public university tuition. But the protests, when they took on an air of a much deeper frustration, tapping into a rage equal in span and scope to those that shook the old dictatorships to their knees way back in the 1980s. Now, trying to hold on to the dream, some of the pink tide governments confronted such threats by taking on authoritarian turns. After Hugo Chavez died of cancer in 2013, for example, his hand-picked successor, Nicolás Maduro, took steps to eliminate the last vestiges of institutional checks and balances in Venezuela at the cost of both democracy and the country's economy. It is now a wreck of epic proportions, as we'll see next week. In Nicaragua, meanwhile, former revolutionary and current president Daniel Ortega has gone to great lengths to destroy the remnants of independent civil society while brutally repressing opposition protest. Most of the pink tide governments, however, have simply been voted out of office, although perhaps simply is not the right word, for the politicians and the movements most responsible for their ouster are not yesterday's neoliberal moderates so much as a new breed of right-wing populist, which brings with them less an ideology than an epic narrative of good and evil, salvation and demise. But that is for another video. For now, let's stick with the third wave of democratization, its wonders and its discontents. Next week, we'll ask if there will ever be a need for a fourth wave. I'm Professor Mike Wolf, and this is Latin American Politics Online.
Soy el fuego que arde tu piel. Soy el agua que mata tu sed, el castillo, la torre, yo soy la espada que guarda el caudal, tú el aire que respiro yo y la luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que ansio mojar.
Os americanos, mais consciência, poucas guerras e poucas intromissões em questão que não são deles, entendeu? Quantas vidas os americanos perderam entrando em guerras que não são delas? Quantas vidas perderam? Vida se perde por dinheiro? Uma vida vale mais do que tudo no mundo. E eu sou um cara que só fiz até a terceira série. Mas eu acho que a maior riqueza que eu achei na minha vida foi meus filhos. Entendeu? A maior riqueza na minha vida foi meus filhos. E eu não posso mandar um filho meu para uma guerra, para morrer por um país. O país é quem? Nada. O país é a população.
Valeu. E qual é o seu nome?
Marcelo.
Marcelo, muito prazer.